Today's edition is all about space planes. There have been numerous examples over the years. Today we take a close look at the Dreamchaser and most of its cousins. Today we are looking at a way to bypass the rocket equation, which is still classified as unavoidable. Expect the engine that makes its own fuel in flight, the fastest manned aircraft in history, the worst kept secret of contemporary space travel, and we'll look at where this idea of the space plane comes from and where it could lead. And what does all this have to do with SpaceX's Starship? So be sure to stay until the end to get the full picture. The history of space planes is a long and frustrating one, and it's anything but light fare. So brace yourself for a tough and packed edition. If you feel like you're learning something here and you're getting value out of my videos, then I'd be happy if you subscribe to Mars Chronicles so we can show the YouTube algorithm that space travel is for everyone. If you like, you can also support me directly on YouTube under this video or on Patreon with a membership. This allows me to produce ever better videos for you. So hit the like button, then we can get started. Hello and welcome to another edition of Mars Chronicles. I'm Sir Juan with your space travel news. Let's take off now for a quicker arrival. In order to paint you a complete picture, let's take a look back at the past. More precisely to the year 1927, when the American adventurer Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic for the first time in his airplane, Spirit of St. Louis, and landed in Paris, Le Bourget. Lindbergh did this not for philanthropic reasons, but because he wanted to win the Orteig Prize of 25,000 United States dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that would be about 400,000 United States dollars today. Charles Lindbergh is known to have sympathized with Nazi ideology. Therefore, he is somewhat problematic in my eyes. But there were some aerospace pioneers who were Nazis. That's why I would like to address this topic in a separate YouTube video. Although Lindbergh did not cross the Atlantic for the noblest reasons, he still bears a great deal of responsibility for a major leap in the development of airplanes. The 25,000 United States dollar prize led to strong investments in the field of aviation. Back then, however, there was no talk of space planes. Why, I'll tell you about it then. Well, because in 1996, billionaire Peter Diamandis took the Orteig Prize as a model and offered a prize of 10 million United States dollars. For this, he founded the XPRIZE Foundation, which has since pursued the goal of creating incentives for technological progress through such competitions. The prize was to go to the one who could manage to fly an airplane over the Kármán line. The Kármán line is the internationally recognized boundary to space. The boundary is named after its inventor or founder, Theodor von Kármán, the Hungarian-American. Physicists wanted to define a boundary above which no airplane can fly anymore because the air up there is already so thin. Although there are still air particles up to well over 100 kilometers high, there are only very few. Therefore, the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale recognized this line, which is still considered the boundary to space today. Except for the Americans, they had to define their own boundary at 50 miles. That's about 80 kilometers. But we digress. The 10 million United States dollar prize money of the Ansari X Prize competition lay around for a whole 8 years until someone managed to cross the Kármán line with an airplane. This someone was Bert Rutan with his Spaceship One from Scale Composites. The first test flights took place in 2003, before the first spaceplane crossed the border into space in June 2004. Spaceship One might sound familiar to you. You're probably thinking that the concept looks very similar to Virgin Galactic. And indeed, Virgin Galactic bought this idea from Scaled Composites. Or rather, they founded a joint venture in 2005 called the Spaceship Company. In 2012, Scaled Composites withdrew from this joint venture, leaving Virgin Galactic as the sole owner of this idea. Virgin Galactic also struggled for a long time until they were able to complete their first commercial flight with passengers this year. The billionaire and patron of this venture, Sir Richard Branson, himself flew on it. If you're interested in this flight, I've made a separate video about it. You can find it here in the info box. In October 2014, Virgin Galactic suffered a severe setback when the VSS Enterprise broke apart during a test flight on re-entry into the atmosphere, costing co-pilot Michael Ellsbury his life. Pilot Peter Siebold was seriously injured in the incident. It turned out that the error had been that the co-pilot had activated the so-called air brake system too early. This led to the ship crashing in the Mojave Desert near Cantil, California. To this day, the re-entry is controlled by the pilot and is not automated. I find this problematic because humans can make mistakes, they can have a bad day or be distracted. I am a big advocate of automation in space travel. Computers are more reliable than humans in many ways, and that's how this so-called air launch system works. A mothership carries the suborbital glider with hybrid drive to about 14 kilometers high and drops the spaceship. Shortly thereafter, the engine ignites and takes the crew into space. And although Spaceship One crossed the Carmel line several times, VSS Unity only flew over the space boundary of 80 kilometers recognized by the United States of America. Once the engine has burned out, the ship still has enough momentum to continue rising. But from there, the passengers already almost experience weightlessness. This state lasts for a few minutes before the crew has to buckle up again as it heads back towards Earth. Before re-entry into the atmosphere, the ship rotates its wings to provide extra air resistance and ensure the necessary stability. This function is also called feather or feather. With over 800 employees, Virgin Galactic has so far only generated a revenue of $240,000 United States dollars. However, it is alleged that over 600 tickets for such suborbital flights have already been sold at $250,000 United States dollars each. Rumors also suggest that Elon Musk will someday board such a plane. Unfortunately, I don't have any details about that. By the way, for the operation of this tourist attraction, Virgin Galactic has built a spaceport in New Mexico, United States of America, costing hundreds of millions of dollars. It looks really cool. Hopefully there will be more action there soon. Over the years, there have been a few such air launch concepts like Launcher One from Virgin Orbit, Pegasus from Northrop Grumman, and Naval Ordnance Test Station, EV-1, also known as NOSNIC, from the United States Navy. Many developments never even saw the light of day, but there are currently some air launchers in development. These include the Valkyrie from Gaia Aerospace in Germany and Arca Space in Romania. However, air launch is not the topic of today. I'm digressing again. Today's topic is spaceplanes. For this, National Aeronautics and Space Administration conducted a 5-part study with the United States Air Force between 1965 and 1969 on so-called integrated launch and reentry vehicles. At that time, the Saturn V was still in operation, but National Aeronautics and Space Administration was looking for a cheaper and reusable alternative. Because adjusted for inflation, a Saturn V mission cost $1.23 billion United States dollars. That's a lot of dough. And National Aeronautics and Space Administration's not stupid. That's why they had reusability in mind back then. This was meant to significantly cut costs. Spoiler alert. Reuse is not in the interest of National Aeronautics and Space Administration's contractors. That would mean less revenue for them. Therefore, they managed to delay reuse until the appearance of SpaceX. In my eyes, United Launch Alliance Boeing and Lockheed have done nothing but dig their own grave for years. And they are already standing with one foot in the grave. Before we get to the Space Shuttle and the Dreamchaser, we need to take a little detour. Wernher von Braun already imagined spacecraft making regular trips to various space stations. Von Braun is also a controversial figure because before he worked for National Aeronautics and Space Administration, he was the leading personality when it came to the development of rockets in Nazi Germany. With Nazis, I like to separate their technical pioneering achievements from their political beliefs. But as I said, the topic deserves its own video. It was also a German who designed the concept for the first space plane. Not von Braun, but Eugen Singer. The Silbervogel consisted of a large fuselage and relatively short wings. The fuselage was designed in such a way that it could generate lift itself. It was supposed to penetrate the highest layers of the atmosphere and surprise the enemy on the other side of the Atlantic with bombs. And that's how it would have worked. The Silverbird was supposed to accomplish long-distance flights with the help of a series of short hops. At the start of its mission, the aircraft was supposed to be accelerated along a 3-kilometer-long railway track by a rocket-powered sled. Once launched, it was supposed to ignite its own rockets and ascend to a flight altitude of 145 kilometers, where it would have flown at a speed of 22,100 kilometers per hour. Then it was supposed to gradually descend into the stratosphere, where the higher air density would have created lift on the flat underside of the aircraft, which would have eventually caused it to bounce and ascend to a greater flight altitude. Then the process would have repeated itself. Due to air resistance, each bounce would have been smaller than the previous one. However, it was calculated that the Silbervogel would have been able to cross the Atlantic, drop a 4,000-kilogram bomb over the American continent, and then continue its flight until landing somewhere in the Japanese part of the Pacific. A journey of a total of 24,000 kilometers. Post-war analyses revealed an error in the calculation of aerodynamic heating during re-entry. The recalculation showed that the Silverbird would have burned up without course correction during re-entry. Nevertheless, it was not impossible to solve this problem. After World War II, both the United States of America and the Soviet Union showed interest in Singer's work. Singer was Austrian, but due to the Anschluss, he was considered German at that time. The design was remarkable as it exploited new rocket techniques around the principle of a glider. In the end, the design was considered too complex and expensive for implementation. Fortunately, there were only wind tunnel tests. But the X-15 from North American Aviation had a great resemblance to the Silbervogel. This set a series of speed and altitude records for manned aircraft in the 1960s. At 7,274 kilometers per hour, it still holds the record for the fastest manned aircraft today. But with only around 200 flights in total, it wasn't the greatest success story. 13 of these flights made it over the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, set boundary to space of 50 miles or 80 kilometers. In 1968, the X-15 was retired, but that really got the world of spaceplanes going. Here are some other developments that have occurred in this field. The HL-10 from Northrop was dropped from great heights several times in 1966 to test its gliding properties, but it never really managed to start operations. Boeing's X-20 Dinosaur was a United States Air Force program that tried to build a space glider that had a wide range of applications. Yes, the aircraft was really called Dinosaur. But not dinosaur as in the dinosaur, but like the dynamic soar. So the dynamic glider, it was supposed to be used to bomb the enemy, sabotage enemy satellites, do reconnaissance work, and maintain our own satellites. The 20 was supposed to launch on a Titan II rocket. The program ran from 1957 to 1963 and swallowed approximately 6.6 billion United States dollars adjusted for inflation. Shortly after the start of construction of the first model, the program was discontinued. In my eyes, every military aircraft that is not built is a blessing. Here, it was quite obvious that they had also based it on the Silverbird. But not only the Germans and the Americans have built space planes. The Soviets also made efforts to build such a vehicle. The Mikoyan-Gurevich, or also MiG-1005, was their version of a manned orbital glider, but it was never more than a prototype built. It was also called Labat because of its nose tip. That's Russian and stands for shoe. The development began in 1965 and was discontinued in 1969. And in response to the American space shuttle, the Soviets resumed the project in 1974. In total, Labat completed 8 hypersonic test flights over the years and was then completely discontinued after an accident in 1978 to free up resources for the development of the Buran. The Buran was the ultimate response to the space shuttle, but it only managed a single flight in 1988 before the Soviet Union collapsed. When I look at the Buran, I see an Ariane 5 and a space shuttle. Of course, the project was not pursued further after the fall of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, but the only unmanned orbital flight was not only successful, but they also demonstrated the ability to land such a glider automatically. We're talking about times over 30 years ago. I still can't fly a plane today, let alone land one. Incredible how far the Russians had come back then. The Buran was launched into orbit with the so-called Energia rocket, which is so similar to the Ariane 5. It was 36 meters long, had a wingspan of 24 meters, and fully fueled, weighed around 75 tons. The Russian space shuttle was capable of carrying 30 tons into a low Earth orbit. For comparison, the shuttle was about the same size, but it managed a bit less, only around 27.5 tons into a low Earth orbit. Remember to subscribe and like, thanks. And so that no one says I never report on the European Space Agency, I would also like to highlight their efforts in this area. The European Spaceplane project is called Hermes and was designed in 1975 by the French Space Agency Centre National d'Études Spatiales. Its appearance was modeled after Boeing's dinosaur. After the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in 1986, which claimed the lives of all 7 astronauts, the program was halted to make the crew cabin detachable. In 1987, the European Space Agency took over the project. The previously mentioned Ariane 5 was actually designed to transport Hermes. I would say target missed. Then, of course, there were budget overruns, delays, and on top of that, the European Space Agency entered into a partnership with the Russian Space Agency, so the development was shut down in 1992. Not a single prototype was built. But during the 2010s, the plans were dusted off, and the European Space Agency made another attempt to build an orbital spacecraft. This time under the name SOR. SOR was to be launched on the back of an Airbus A300, where it would be dropped to ignite its Russian NK-39 engine and carry a maximum payload of 250 kilograms into space. This engine could have taken the spacecraft to a height of about 80 kilometers. After that, SOAR could theoretically have landed on a runway. With an additional disposable upper stage, it could also have had orbital capabilities. The first flight was supposed to take place in 2017, over 30 years after the initiation of this project. Would have, could have, should have. The final dagger in the heart of the project came when the company that was supposed to operate SOAR, namely Swiss Space Systems, was declared bankrupt by a Swiss court at the end of 2016. After heavy indebtedness, they were so desperate that they almost took a loan from an unlicensed bank in Singapore. But that was prevented by the government in Singapore. Thus, the European Space Agency is once again without its own astronaut program. Between 1995 and 2002, National Aeronautics and Space Administration worked on the X-38, another space glider that was supposed to serve as an escape module for the International Space Station. This was also supposed to launch on an Ariane 5. In total, there were 3 prototypes that were built consecutively and each built on the findings of the previous model. The X-38 could have safely brought 7 people back to Earth from the International Space Station. In the tests, the wingless vehicle was brought to great heights with a B-52 and dropped. National Aeronautics and Space Administration led the development, but according to Wikipedia, the European Space Agency and the German Space Agency were also involved. The vehicle was built by Scaled Composites, the same ones who built Spaceship One. And amusingly, Rob Meyerson was also involved in the construction of the X-38. He later became president of Blue Origin before Bob Smith took over, and now sits on the board of Axiom Space. I reported about this in my video about space stations. I'll link the video here in the info box. The X-38 used the largest parachute that has ever flown to this day. Traditionally, the size of such parachutes is given in square feet. Converted, this parachute had an area of around 700 square meters. But even the largest parachute in the world could not save this program. Due to massive budget overruns, the development was discontinued in 2002. Very similar to this is an Italian project named Space Rider. Space Rider is supported by the European Space Agency and is intended to provide the European Space Agency with routine access to space. However, this vehicle can't transport people, only cargo. The maiden flight is scheduled to take place in the third quarter of 2023 with a Vega C rocket. This glider is designed to land with a parachute, similar to Rocket and Space Corporation Energia's Russian Clipper project. The Russians, between 2004 and 2006, it was supposed to replace the currently operating Soyuz spacecraft. Clipper could have transported 6 people to the International Space Station. This project has also disappeared into some drawer in Moscow at the moment. Maybe it will resurface someday. The Indian Space Research Organization, the Indian Space Agency, also had a successful test of their reusable launch vehicle technology demonstrator in 2016. That was supposed to be a small version of what they are planning. In the test, the spacecraft reached a height of 80 kilometers and is supposed to be able to reach orbital speeds. So far, hypersonic speeds have only been achieved with the help of a solid rocket. And you've already guessed it. If the United States of America, India, and even the European Space Agency are working on an idea, then China won't be long in coming. They are planning a 2-stage, fully reusable spacecraft. This summer, they are rumored to have launched such a vehicle into space. Of course, this is only speculation, but I can well imagine it. It's supposed to be a mini version of the X-37. The Boeing X-37 of the United States Air Force is pretty much the worst-kept secret in contemporary space travel. It's a space plane, which is essentially a baby version of the space shuttle. It could even have fit into the cargo bay of the shuttle, as it's even smaller than the Dreamchaser. If the X-37 had come out of the shuttle's cargo bay, it would have looked like the shuttle was having a baby. It's a 120% larger version of the Boeing X-40. National Aeronautics and Space Administration started the project, handed it over to Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and now the Space Force has taken over. Theoretically, it's a closely guarded military secret. But pictures were released, and thanks to the internet, not even the United States military could hide these pictures again. Since 2010, 6 missions have become known. During the last mission, the aircraft spent 779 days, or about 2 years, in Earth orbit testing engines, heat pumps, and ion thrusters. At least, that's what the official side says, but we know how much we can trust the military's information. Since it's so small, it probably won't carry any bombs, but it's certainly suitable as a spy station. Some accuse the United States of America of using the X-37 to spy on the Chinese space station Tiangong. But I won't stoop to this level of rumor mill. In any case, it is brought into orbit with an Atlas V and can probably fly around quite freely with its engines and cause all sorts of mischief. You see, the history of space planes is a long and frustrating one. But now it's going to get really tough. The previously mentioned 5-part study by National Aeronautics and Space Administration ultimately led to a compromise, because that was what the space shuttle really was. There were really cool designs for truly reusable rockets and space planes. But President Richard Nixon, Congress, and the United States military wanted the space shuttle because it was big enough to carry their gigantic spy satellites, and it promised quick and cheap reuse. Officially, the project was known as the Space Transportation System, or Space Transportation System for short. In the 30 years between 1981 and 2011, when the shuttle was in operation, 5 shuttle orbiters were used: Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour. Even though the maiden flight took place 10 years before I was born, I still, as a child, witnessed numerous shuttle launches. Back then, I thought that was the future. During the Apollo era, they landed with a shabby capsule in the ocean with parachutes and had to be rescued. And little Serwin saw the space shuttles landing on runways and was thrilled. Joe Scott also says it in his video. Today the shuttles are museum artifacts and we are landing again in capsules in the ocean. It feels like a step backwards. If you're still looking for a cool Christmas gift, then I have just the thing for you. The new Mars Chronicles merch shop is online. There you can also find Vertical Takeoff and Moon Whisper merch. We've teamed up to offer you a better shopping experience, so feel free to check it out and treat yourself to something nice. There were numerous reasons for the retirement of the shuttle. We'll get to that shortly. It was not just a cash purchase for the contractors, but it was an important component in the construction of the International Space Station. And thanks to the shuttle, we were able to bring the Hubble Space Telescope into orbit. Even when the Hubble needed repairs, the space shuttle was there. In total, it completed 135 missions. 133 of them were successful. The remaining 2 each cost 7 people their lives and ultimately also ended the space shuttle program. In 1987, 7 people were killed during the launch of the Challenger shuttle. I deliberately use the word killed here because they didn't just die. These deaths are the direct result of severe bureaucracy and the greed of contractors. Years before this disaster, it was known that there were problems with some clearance rings. Numerous reports pointed this out, but the fear of change and reiteration prevented it from being fixed. Following the motto, "It will be fine," what could possibly happen? In fact, there was an emergency meeting just before the launch of the Challenger due to the cold temperatures. That's exactly where the weakness of the sealing rings presented itself. They became porous and brittle at temperatures around freezing point, so they couldn't fulfill their only task. At the last minute, the crisis team decided against another launch abort, and for the launch, thus deciding to kill this crew. And this despite the engineers' warning of a disaster. Eventually, the shuttle program was put on ice for 2 years, while this junction was improved. 2 years because of a single O-ring. Let that sink in. It becomes clear here why they didn't want to abort the launch, because that would have been like an admission. But their arrogance didn't allow for that. Mistakes can happen. But one must recognize these and eliminate them. Burying your head in the sand doesn't make anything better. After that, 88 successful missions took place before the second catastrophe in 2003 shook space travel in the entire world. Here, the fate of the 7 crew members was also sealed at launch. A few seconds after launch, a piece of foam broke off from the external tank and hit the front of the left wing. This damaged a reinforced carbon-carbon panel. When the orbiter re-entered the atmosphere on February 1st, 2003, hot gases entered through the leak behind the heat shield tiles and destroyed the shuttle from the inside out. The crew had no chance of survival. Tragic. And now it's going to get even tougher. When the return-to-flight mission space transportation system, 114, launched 2 years later, a piece of foam also broke off from the external tank, but missed the orbiter. In the meantime, the International Space Station operated with a crew of only 2 astronauts. The Endeavour was also hit by such a chunk during the Space Transportation System, 118. However, the damage was minimal compared to the Columbia. The second return-to-flight mission, Space Transportation System, 121, also had a similar problem with a crack in the foam around the external tank. Here, they consciously risked the lives of the crew again, because even though the chief engineer and safety officer for the mission advised against launching, the decision was made not to listen to him. Luckily, everything went well. But that was just a lottery ticket, and that's not how space travel should be conducted. Finally, George W. Bush announced the end of the Space Shuttle in 2004. The last mission was Space Transportation System, 134. But in 2010, another flight was decided to perform service work on Hubble. They took a big risk again here, arguing that the crew can wait for their rescue on the International Space Station in case of damage. Finally, the Space Shuttle Atlantis flew the last Space Transportation System mission in July. Until the launch in July 2011, until the launch of the Crew Demo 2 mission by SpaceX on May 30th, 2020, the United States of America, but also Europe, were dependent on flying to the International Space Station in the Russian Soyuz. It's really a tragic story that didn't have to go this way. To date, 18 people have died. while serving in space exploration. 14 of those were due to the space shuttle. Aside from 14 human fatalities, the space shuttle also failed to keep its promise of launching quickly and cost-effectively. After each mission, all 20,500 heat shield tiles had to be inspected by hand or replaced. Each of them had an individual shape and size. You can imagine how much work that must be. This leads to startup costs of up to 1.6 billion United States dollars. With that, you can launch 10 Crew Dragons today. Before we get to the highlight of today's edition, I have a quote from the Chief Engineer for Space Shuttle Handling, Stephen Sullivan. The end of each mission set in motion a 4 to 5 month process that involved over 750,000 man-hours and literally millions of processing steps to prepare the space shuttle for the next flight. I still say that National Aeronautics and Space Administration and the United States government were taken for a ride here. 40% of the fleet failed in a catastrophic manner. And almost 1.5% of the missions have failed. They were lucky that nothing more happened. That makes the space shuttle the most dangerous vehicle in history. Not merely in space travel history, but in all of human history. Of the approximately 600 people who have been in space, the shuttle brought 355 of them there. That is still quite an achievement, despite everything. Maybe I should do an issue with Aeneas critiquing the shuttle technically. What do you say? Let me know in the comments what you think of this story. It's really sad that the shuttle program was discontinued, but a silver lining is that we may soon witness the return of spaceplanes. Nonetheless, the space shuttle has proven the concept of spaceplanes and thus paved the way for further developments. Take the space shuttle, dramatically simplify it, make the first stage with the solid boosters and the big orange external tank reusable, and you have your Starship. If you don't look at the whole thing so gigantically, then you get more of a Dreamchaser. This is being developed and built by Sierra Nevada Corporation, or SNC for short. SNC has had its headquarters in Nevada since 1963 and is not known for producing particularly peaceful products. In fact, one of their biggest customers is the military. In 1994, former SNC employee Fatih Osman and his wife Erin bought the company and initiated a shift towards commercial space travel. In 2008, Fatih and Erin went shopping and treated themselves to SpaceDev. That's the company that built the hybrid engines for Spaceship One and Virgin Galactic's VSS Unity and Spaceship Two. SpaceDev is also involved in dynamics design. They were involved in their lunar lander Alpaca. Alpaca stands for Autonomous Logistics Platform for All Moon Access. Dynetics lost to SpaceX's Starship in this year's Artemis competition for National Aeronautics and Space Administration is Lunar Lander. Blue Origin also participated and lost. Then they sued because they are sore losers, lost the lawsuit, and are even more upset, which has annoyed National Aeronautics and Space Administration. However, the flagship of the Sierra Nevada Corporation is the Dreamchaser, which they had designed for National Aeronautics and Space Administration's Commercial Crew Program. And again, SNC lost to SpaceX. But this time, there was also a second winner, namely Boeing with their Starliner capsule. Nevertheless, they made it to the shortlist, which always means that they have already bagged large sums of funding. By the way, in the last phase of development, SpaceX received $2.6 billion and Boeing $4.2 billion United States dollars from National Aeronautics and Space Administration for the completion of a functional crew capsule. And we all know how that ended. Boeing has yet to log a successful test flight, while SpaceX is now routinely ferrying crew to and from the International Space Station. Boeing subsequently received an additional $300 million United States dollars because they apparently can't manage money. Back to the Dreamchaser. SNC only dropped out in the fifth and final phase of the competition and had collected $363 million United States dollars from National Aeronautics and Space Administration by then. Apparently that was enough for them to continue working on it, and eventually in 2016 they did get a contract with National Aeronautics and Space Administration for cargo transports as part of the second Commercial Resupply Services program. The Dreamchaser is about 10 meters long and can bring about 5 tons of cargo to the International Space Station. If it ever gets approved for humans, a 3 to 7 member crew can fit. By default, it is supposed to be brought into orbit on the Vulcan Centaur by United Launch Alliance. In 2013, the German Aerospace Center conducted a study to assess the potential benefits of the Dreamchaser for European space travel. A year later, the European Space Agency agreed to participate in the so-called DC-4 European Union project. That stands for Dreamchaser for European Utilization. This variant for European operations could be transported on an Ariane 5 rocket. I find this really strange because the Ariane 5 is supposed to be replaced by the new Ariane 6, and yet they are adapting the Dreamchaser to the Ariane 5. This smells again of strong budget overruns and delays when they realize in a few years, oh, now we have to redesign the Dreamchaser again because there are no more Ariane 5 rockets. Another 5 years wasted just like that. If the Dreamchaser launches on the Atlas V, there will be no user fairings to protect it during ascent. That's exactly what the European Space Agency is trying to figure out for their Ariane 5 as well. The wings of the Dreamchaser are theoretically foldable and would fit into the user fairing of the Ariane 5. But understandably, they want to avoid this to save costs and weight. However, Dreamchaser has also attracted other customers. This includes the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. They have chosen the Dreamchaser to launch their first cargo mission, which includes scientific experiments in 2024. Over the years, there have been the following prototypes. The first iteration, named Eagle, was in the air for about 5 minutes during the first 4 tests, following so-called drop tests, where the spacecraft is dropped from a great height. After that, it was immediately retired. The second prototype, named Ascension, will be used for further atmospheric drop tests in the near future. The next model is expected to be the one that will be used for the SNC Demo 1 mission next year. Here, the Dreamchaser, named Tenacity, which means perseverance, is to be launched into an Earth orbit on a Vulcan Centaur, dock at the International Space Station, and conduct tests there for 82 days. Assuming Blue Origin manages to deliver the engines for the Vulcan Centaur, but it doesn't look like it. That's why the SNC Demo 1 mission will probably be delayed by at least another year. If Blue Origin doesn't deliver the BE-4 engines, much more will be delayed than just the Dreamchaser demo flight. The Dreamchaser is supposed to complete 15 flights before it needs a major overhaul. It's similar to the Space Shuttle with heat shield tiles on the underside. However, the number of tiles here is not over 20,000, but 2,000. Firstly, because the spaceship to be protected is much smaller, but also because the tiles have a side length of 25 instead of 15 centimeters. In addition, he navigates in zero gravity with ethanol, which is not toxic. One reason for the use of a Dreamchaser is also that it can quickly and safely evacuate people from the International Space Station. In case of emergency, for example, in the event of illness or injury, the crew could return to Earth in a few hours and be treated directly on the runway. Not so if they land in a capsule in the ocean and still have to be recovered. The Dreamchaser still has an ace up its sleeve. To get rid of garbage on the International Space Station, it has a jettisonable module that burns up in the atmosphere. This is crucial because International Space Station garbage must also be disposed of. We now know that the SNC is already in exchange with the European Space Agency for a European version of the Dreamchasers. They have 6 fixed booked flights as part of the second Customer Reservation System program, a mission for United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. And anyone who has seen my video about the space stations of the future knows that Blue Origin wants to rely on the Dreamchaser for their space stations. The Gateway Foundation also presents the Dreamchaser as a central component of their planned space stations. In fact, SNC not only supplies the Dreamchaser for Blue Origin's Orbital Reef Space Station, but is generally involved in its construction. The space station is expected to be operational by 2027. According to an article by Michael Sheets, they have raised $1.4 billion United States dollars in investment capital this year. so they will probably continue their activities for some time. If this works, both Blue Origin and the Gateway Foundation could buy or lease large quantities of the Dreamchasers. That would be the ultimate breakthrough. At the moment, it is only approved for cargo, but once in operation, approval for humans could be achieved within 5 years. What's your opinion? Could the Dreamchaser succeed? Share your thoughts in the comments. The Dreamchaser, the Shuttle, and the Russian Buran are so-called vertical takeoff and horizontal landing vehicles because they take off vertically and land horizontally. This always requires one or more stages to get it into space before it can be useful. However, there are concepts that take space travel to a whole new level. This brings us to the Skylon. This is what is known as in single stage to orbit or single stage to orbit. This means that this device can reach orbital speed and height on its own power. In addition, it is a horizontal takeoff and landing vehicle, a horizontal takeoff and landing vehicle, so it takes off and lands horizontally. And again, this design is based on the Nazis' Silverbird. Many believe that such a concept makes no sense because of the relentless rocket equation. But what if I tell you that the British company Reaction Engines is trying to cheat and bypass the rocket equation? Reaction Engines is working on the so-called Skylon. This space plane is built and designed around a central engine. Like other rockets, the main development work goes into the engine named Sabre. That stands for Synergetic Air-Breathing Rocket Engine, a synergistic air-breathing rocket engine. What this means is that the engine can strongly cool down the ambient air when it is sucked in, separate the oxygen from the rest, and store it. Skylon is supposed to be fueled only with hydrogen. This saves the oxygen at the start. This is only produced by the engine during flight. Of course, there is enough oxygen on the ground at launch for the engine to breathe. The engine takes advantage of this until the air becomes too thin to maintain stable combustion in the combustion chamber. Sabre relies on a combined cycle and has 2 modes. In the first mode, ambient air is drawn in, compressed, and cooled down with the help of helium in the pre-cooler. This air is directed into the combustion chamber, where it reacts and burns with the stored hydrogen. By pre-cooling the air, light alloys can be used here, as they do not have to withstand high temperatures in the combustion chamber. If I understood correctly, an excess of oxygen is produced in this phase, so that a part of it can be stored for the later part of the flight. Sabre is supposed to be able to generate twice as much thrust as the best jet engines of today. They might also have to bring a small amount of oxygen, but this idea should save quite a lot of mass, because most of the energy is needed to break through the dense layers of the atmosphere. This is exactly the problem this engine addresses. However, the air is not liquefied. This results in greater efficiency. When the air intake is closed at Mach 5 and an altitude of 28.5 kilometers, the engine switches to the second mode. From now on, it's a high-performance closed rocket propulsion cycle using the oxygen produced in flight and the onboard hydrogen to reach an orbit. General Dynamics was already working with the United States Air Force on a similar concept in the 1960s. Then the idea was pursued further by a joint venture between British Aerospace and Rolls-Royce. When Rolls-Royce withdrew from this venture and British Aerospace no longer had anyone who could build the engine, they finally gave up. Then in 1989, some engineers and scientists came together and founded the company Reaction Engines Limited and continued to research this idea. In 2016, they received a grant of £60 million from the British government and the European Space Agency and $40 million from other investors to build a demonstrator. So-called proof of concept. They were to prove that this idea is not nonsense. And this summer, they did just that. Their test facility is located at the Aerospace port in Colorado. They directed the hot exhaust gases of an old F-4 Phantom fighter bomber directly into the Sabre prototype and were able to cool them down to minus 150 degrees Celsius in a 20th of a second. That's a big and important milestone. Skylon should be able to transport up to 12 tons of payload to the International Space Station. That's quite impressive. With a price of 1,800 United States dollars per kilogram, it manages to undercut the usual suspects in space travel. However, this would still put the price per kilogram 400 United States dollars above the price of the Falcon Heavy. And once Starship goes into operation, the entire space travel industry loses its raison d'etre anyway. Because Starship is supposed to be able to push the price per kilogram down to 10 United States dollars or less. Skylon is supposed to be able to complete long-haul flights in 1 or 2 hours. Starship can cover these distances in less than an hour. But after 30 years of work in this major breakthrough, they won't stop. I think there's a lot more to come. What do you think of Skylon? Does it have a future, or is it British-style occupational therapy? Let me know in the comments. So now I would like to thank all my patrons and YouTube channel members once again for your support. A very special thanks goes to my newest mission specialist, Raphael. Thank you all. You make it possible for me to take this channel to new levels. So my dear ones, that's it for today from my side. I say thank you very much for tuning in and see you soon on Mars.